So for the intended learning outcomes of this lesson, first is to familiarize students with the concept of multiculturalism and multicultural literacy. Second is to formulate ways in promoting multicultural literacy inside the classroom. And third, know the skills and knowledge required to be multiculturally literate. As cultures begins to mix and change as a result of globalization, conflicts inevitably arise over identity, values, and worldviews. So this situation consequently needs for a literacy that enables us to quickly and easily identify and resolve such conflicts, preferably before they even begin. So this has come to be understood as a multicultural literacy. So multicultural literacy is a set of skills and knowledge is difficult to define because of how it is changes depending on the context in which it is discussed. So for example, multicultural literacy is defined in American literature is different from how it is deployed in a more European context. So in America, cultural literacy has a very strong learnings toward knowing or identifying the polyethnic origins of knowledge with the expressive goal of fostering equality, diversity, and social justice. So this is in direct response to the Eurocentric and white dominant traditions of education that in the eyes of American culture minorities, particularly in blacks, is a form of racial injustice. So this is very foreign to the Philippine context, which despite having our own deeply ingrained traditions of discrimination, does not have the same issues of discrimination as in the United States, nor the same amount of hostility. So nevertheless, the fact that the perceived need for multicultural literacy stems for a slight sense of justice. So for the other, that is any individual or group or culture that another individual or group or culture considers not of us for any reason cannot be ignored in our attempts to pin down a functional definition of multicultural literacy in ourselves. Meanwhile, in Europe, multicultural literacy comes more in the form of intercultural communication competence or ICC, which is defined by Dossi and Steinbach 2014 as a composite of skills, abilities, attitudes, personality patterns, and etc. So necessary for clear and productive communication with cultures other than our own. Similarly, Fantini 2006 defines as a complex of abilities needed to perform effectively and appropriately when interacting with others who are linguistically and culturally different from oneself. Clearly, the broader and more magnanimous European definition of multicultural literacy is more fitting for the Philippine context, even if the exact definition of what ICC of is still being hotly debated. For the purposes of this book, it would also be wise to include how justice contributes to the literacy. That is, there would be no discussion on multicultural literacy if not for the lack of justice in multicultural discussion or discourse. So for captivate, so what comes into your mind upon seeing these pictures? So the follow-up questions. So first is, how can you teach multicultural literacy in the classroom? How important of diversity in the classroom? And why is teaching multicultural literacy in the classroom necessary?